So I'd like to present for you a paper I submitted to Trinity Seminary called Duality by Design. Before I get answers, I have to ask questions. And my questions are, why did God create Satan? Why did he allow Satan to tempt Eve? Why did he then allow Satan to torment Job? And that leads to is suffering and evil something that makes us better? Is duality and the design a clue of the plan? Is free will a tool in that design? Then what that brings me to is, where do I look for answers? Well, where else would you look for answers but the Bible? And it starts to reveal some clues about the perfect plan. It reveals clues about the fall of Lucifer, who becomes Satan, who plays a very major role in humankind and the human drama. It tells me more about the Garden of Eden and what took place. The book of Job reveals some very interesting aspects of this idea of suffering and evil and God's plan for us. And of course, I touch on free will because free will seems to be something we all need to talk about. And pretty soon, what you have come together is God's plan. And of course, it wouldn't be complete if we didn't talk about what it means to be in the image of God. And pretty soon, this duality as a part of this design becomes pretty clear. Let's talk about the perfect plan. God left us humans without crucial knowledge of his will. He did this on purpose, as we read in Jeremiah. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for your welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. So a couple things jump out at me right away. First of all, there is a plan, right? That plan is for my welfare. It's not for evil. And that plan is meant to give me a future and a hope. So I know there's a plan. I know that I'm not a part of that plan, or at least my knowledge of the plan is not important to the plan. And I like to think of this as, example would be if I was surprising a buddy of mine with a party. I certainly would not clue him in on the plans because that would kind of ruin the surprise. I realize that's kind of the simple explanation, but that's the only one I can come up with at the moment. So a more perfect being created in the image of God, which I am, would possess the knowledge of good and evil. I would. I wouldn't want to go through life not knowing right and wrong. I just wouldn't want that. So another thing I know about the perfect plan is that God is the perfect planner. So there is a parallel between God's foreknowledge and his will. What I mean by that is that nothing is not unknown to God. So we don't have that benefit. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. So I plan without any foreknowledge of what's going to happen. God plans with definite foreknowledge of what's going to happen. So God's never caught off guard. So God created Lucifer with the knowledge of his fall, and that he would become Satan. What does that imply? Well, the original fall tells us a few things also. A reasonably good angel fell and became Satan. We know this in Ezekiel. Consider God as the perfect planner, and that his plan is the perfect plan. Consider Satan, who is hell-bent on preventing God's plan and perverting his plan. Consider divine foreknowledge and will are hand in hand. Consider Satan as adversary in the context of suffering. So, why would God create a nemesis, right? because God needed a nemesis. Consider then, Satan becomes the first duality in creation, this duality of light and dark. God is light, and in him there is no darkness. Satan is the prince of darkness. Before the fall of man, there was the fall of an angel. The divine plan required this to happen. So Satan must exist. For Satan to exist, creation of angel named Lucifer must occur. There's abundant evidence that the biblical authors believed that Satan was subject to God's control and was used by God to accomplish his purpose. And we'll see evidence of this in the book of Job. Satan opposes God and man in an attempt to frustrate God's plan. Satan is not God's equal or as one who acts independently of divine control. Therefore, Satan's efforts are used by God to further his plan. I think that's important because I think sometimes we unfortunately give Satan a little more credit than he deserves. Satan is nothing more than a pawn for God, and he was created for God's use. God creates the Garden of Eden, and within that Garden of Eden, he puts man, which is Adam, and it gives him access to the knowledge of good and evil. He tells him there's a tree from which you cannot eat the fruit. This is access. So he points out the tree to him. Then Satan is allowed access to Adam and Eve. Why? Why would God allow the craftiest of all creatures he created to tempt his creation? Similar access is given to Satan in Job 1:2, 1:12. Keep in mind, God is a perfect planner. Then his plan is a perfect plan. Whether or not we understand it really does not make much difference, because we trust God and God's looking out for us. We know it is the perfect plan for everything to come together. We can then presuppose that this actual world we live in is the best possible world it can be. Even though we don't think it is, it is. Because again, a perfect planner would not plan for an imperfect world. It just wouldn't happen. A nice little tongue twister I like to tell myself is that a perfect party planner would not plan a imperfect party. An imperfect party planner would plan the perfect party. That's a bit of a tongue twister. So in a world with as much good but less evil, that world would be better, right? Similarly, if there was a world with no evil, that world would be better, right? No, not necessarily. If you have a perfect planner and he plans the perfect world, and that world contains evil, then and evil and good, then you can assume that it is the perfect world that we live in. So therefore, it's not sufficient to say the actual world we live in is good. In fact, the actual world we live in is perfect. As a theist, it should also not be held that a created world with less evil is better, because that would be a more perfect world, right? And the world we live in with right now is, in fact, perfect. So we come to the book of Job, which is a very troubling book for a lot of people because we think it puts God in a bad light. And right off the bat, in the first chapter of Job, there is this dialogue between Satan and God, and it makes us uneasy. And a little backdrop, God caused angels to Satan is amidst the angels and comes forward. And God asks Satan, what have you been up to? And Satan says, well, I've been on the earth, walking around, going here and there and stuff. And God says, have you checked out my servant Job? He's pretty righteous. And Satan says, yeah, but does Job fear God for nothing? I mean, yeah, I've given him everything and stuff. So, of course the guy's going to like you, right? And God says, very well then. Go in and test Job. Let's see what happens. And everything he has is in your power. But you cannot lay a finger on Job. So Satan was subject to God's control. We know this because God gives Satan permission to accomplish his purposes. And again, we have to keep in mind that God is not caught off guard. God already knows the outcome of what's going to happen. So there is no roll of the dice, if you will. So what does Job reveal to us? First thing it does, it reveals this duality. The duality of good and evil, right? Pain and pleasure is what it reveals to us. It reveals that God's plan for Satan, that Satan is under the control of God. He does not act independently of anything. It reveals a relational God, a God who knows Job, talks to Job, knows what's going on earth. It also reveals his plan for his created. If we can grasp that such eternal glories could not have been realized without the fall, that's to say that without the creation of Satan, without the fall of man in the garden, we would not have this relationship, this plan that we are part of. Then we can appreciate how a wise and gracious Creator put it together. And like I said, sometimes we may not understand it, but that really doesn't make much difference. So it's important to realize the book of Job is a wisdom book. It's the last wisdom book of the Old Testament. It addresses the problem of suffering, and also it points out that difficulties in life can lead to great achievements and ethical sacrifices. We do not know how Job changed after this. We do know that he became wealthier, but we do not know of the relationship between Job and God and how it changed because of this. Suffering can develop virtue. I know this personally because I've grown most in times of difficulty and suffering. And also during those times, my faith was challenged and I had to keep myself centered on God. And that might be a story behind Job. Augustine lays it out this way. He says, good and evil cannot exist without each other. And in the book of Job, we see a duality of good and evil. The two at battle with each other. Another view of Augustine is the idea that absence of good is evil. So when you take away good, all you see is evil. Edmund Burke put it this way. He said the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Pleasure does come from pain. It may seem odd when you hear that, but it is true. And it goes back to what Augustine was saying, that good and evil go hand in hand. The contrast in life between good and evil, light and dark, are in relationship with one another. So the hard times in life is a stimulus for us to do better and to sacrifice ourselves ethically. Suffering can develop virtue. So what we find is what Augustine would call the happy fault. That is the idea that through these trials of evil in the world, man can increase his self-worth. And this is a process where we win through inner satisfaction with the human existence. Thus, we see a duality of negative and positive, where the negative can be considered a source of the positive. Pleasure comes from pain. What's the plan then? The climax of the book of Job lies in the speeches of God in chapters 38 through 41. In chapter 7, Job asks God, "Why have you made me your target?" God doesn't bother to answer Job until chapter 38. In the interim, Job's friends go to town on him. And they go back and forth with tons of arguments, trying to convince Job that certainly you've done something wrong. And just come clean and ask for forgiveness, and all will be made right in the world. And Job tells his friends, "No, this isn't true." And they're like, "Well, sure it's true, because certainly good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, right? That's the way it is." Well, finally God answers Job in chapter 38. And the first thing God does is refutes the simplistic attitude of Job's friends, saying that wickedness will bring suffering and righteousness brings blessings. He reminds Job of his powers in creating the world. Then he calls on Job to do something, which is just get back to your simple faith. Give up these questions. You will never understand what's going on. It's not that important anyways. All you have to do is trust me. I've got your... Like I said, perhaps this is the story behind Job. It's the struggle to maintain integrity and battle to hang on and keep your trust in God when things don't work out your way. Suffering then is merely the fact that brings us closer to God in a struggle to maintain our integrity and our faith that lies behind it. This is what Job might be all about. As we know, free will is the ability to act freely without any kind of coercion or constraint. A determinism is the opposite of free will. It suggests that only one course of action is possible. So, if you say, "Why did God give us free will?" It would have been better if God hadn't given us free will. Then you're talking about a world in which determinism is the only possible way. And that would be every course of events would only have one possible way of going. That sounds like not the kind of world I want to live in. And so if you live in a world that's free, then you can expect that there's going to be corruption in the system, like Augustine pointed out. You're going to have evil. You're going to have people that do wrong. And of course, this is the argument presented by Planning when he said free will is evil is a part of free will, kind of a byproduct of free will. So this is what we run into when we think of sin and free will. Sin is a result of us exercising our free will and not the way it was intended, but rather than flirting with temptation. Duality is contrast. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that you cannot know good unless you know bad. You cannot know up unless you know down. You cannot know light if you don't know dark. So you get the idea. Duality of design does not imply duality in the designer. A lot of times you put duality and God in the same sentence, people get angry. Duality for God is like paint for the artist. It is the medium in which his design, his plan comes together. As we've seen, Satan and God represent a duality. We see this in the very beginning of creation as the plan comes together. Now, if we are to accept God's omnipotence, then we are to understand that he is a perfect planner. Therefore, his plan is perfect. And our opinion of his plan doesn't really matter that much. Job, asked God in chapter 7, why have you done this to me? Why have you made me your target? And God answers Job in chapter 38. He answers them out of a storm, and he says, who is it this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Now, there's a couple things I like about this. First of all, we see again this word plan. God has a plan, and we are in that plan. We might not understand it, we might not like it, but really that's non-consequential. Another thing I like is the way God says, who obscures my plan with words without knowledge. That's a nice way of saying, you know what, you don't know what you're talking about, and you can move on. So what is God's overarching purpose in all he does? I know the notion of God being behind temptation is troubling, but it's not without precedence. We've seen this in the book of Job, that God is behind letting Satan have access to Job. Also, we see this in the book of Genesis. God allows Satan into the Garden of Eden, and he allows him to tempt Eve. Again, it may be troubling, but it's not without precedence, and we have plenty of evidence to suggest that. Why is this? Well, it's God's plan. We don't understand God's plan. You're absolutely right. We don't understand God's plan. But if we trust in God, we know that God does have a plan, and he's looking out for us, like it says in Jeremiah, not for our evil, but for our future and our hope. Then we can rest easy. Another thing we know, and we always keep in mind, Satan is not God's equal. Satan is not acting independently of divine control. Therefore, one must be careful not to avoid exaggerating the powers of Satan. Satan is not above God. He's not even equal to God. And he does not act without God's authority. Satan is God's adversary. We know this. But God created Satan. So whatever he does falls on the overarching sovereignty of God. And always keep in mind that the parallel of divine foreknowledge and will. Nothing happens that God doesn't know about. So we come to the fall. This is the transition of humanity from a state of obedience to God to a state of disobedience. The serpent, which was the craftiest of all the beasts in the field the Lord had made, is granted access to the garden. He is granted access to Eve. And he tells Eve, he hints to Eve that God is withholding from Adam and Eve. Before Eve's temptation, that is taken of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, and before Adam's temptation, which is also taken a bite, they had already fallen away due to the disobedience, through to their free will. What I mean by that is they had already flirted with temptation. They were given explicit instructions to not go near the tree, and yet they flirted with temptation. Eve listened to what Satan had to say. Instead of turning away and running away, she did that. So they'd already fallen away. And again, this is that corruption Gusson talks about. This is the changeability, the free will that is within the created. Every creature has the ability to run, and every creature has the ability to flirt with disaster. Evil, therefore, is a loss of goodness. Not a loss of your soul, but just a lack of your goodness. The ability for you to run from temptation is, in fact, evil. The goodness that is proper to all of us, knowing what's right and what's wrong. Psychoanalysis, Eric Fromm, put it this way. Sin that led to the expulsion from the Garden of Eden was the mutual accusation exchanged between Adam and Eve. They were selfish and alienated. I wasn't there, but I can only imagine what went down. I'm sure both of them pointed fingers. I'm sure both of them accused each other of doing something wrong. And that's what did it. They separated from themselves. They were no longer in a relationship. Alienation was not only the sin, but also the punishment. God did not need to expel Eve and Adam from the garden. By perceiving themselves outside of God, they had already done that. And we know this because they became aware and they were naked and they clothed themselves. So they are already ashamed. And outside of that, we know that they hid from God, right? And they would not come out. In this sense, then, paradise and hell are not physical places, but mental states. We put ourselves in hell every day. The Garden of Eden is love. Love for all aspects of humans. Love for you, love for me, love for each other. Hell, then, is the alienation from God's creation. One thing we do know that God commands us is to love one another. And when we do not love one another, we are evil. We are in sin. I know this doesn't sound good, but in fact, it is the truth. And I start with this every single day. Humanity has been in hell for a very long time, in my opinion. People, nations, civilizations live amidst division and estrangement, emphasizing selfish aspect of humans while neglecting others. My needs come first, your needs come second. We see this especially nowadays in our political climate. The more acute this separation becomes, the more that one side of this duality strengthens themselves, usually at the expense of the other side. The greater the corruption becomes, the greater the flaw are in the design God had for us. This could be thought of as the corruption that we have done. It's not because we ruined God's plan. It's because that we have been given free will, and we therefore are running away from good. We're giving in to evil. So, in the Imago Dei, we are created in the image of God. So we know that this duality is not by accident. That God created mankind in his image. He created them male and female, He created them. This is what we know. Male and female to be in relationship to one another. This duality, this idea that two separate things come from one. The theologian Karl Barth puts it this way. He says that our love to God is a vertical relationship between us and God. And when we love each other, that is a horizontal relationship. And the relational aspect is seen in the fact that man is created in the image of God, male and female. God, the triune God, is in relationship between the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Man is capable of having a relationship with God and other human beings. But we also know man is capable of not having a relationship with God and not being in a relationship with other human beings. Therefore, God created man free to have fellowship with him. That's what he desires, and to have fellowship with human beings. God stresses this over and over again. Even in the book of Matthew, he makes it very clear. His disciples ask him, God, what are the first and greatest commandments? And the teacher says, which is the greatest commandment and laws? Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. That is the vertical relationship. And second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. My daughter is in law school right now, and she tells me how hard it is. She's studying torts and contract law, and just goes over case files and case files. And I use her as an analogy. I tell people, could you imagine studying all the laws and studying the Bible backwards and forwards and just spending years and years and years, and you about have it, and you're about to graduate law school, and your professor comes up and says, you've done a great job, congratulations, but now I'm going to let you in on something. There's only really two laws you have to know. And if you have those two laws down, you've got everything else down. I shared this with my daughter once, and she was like, I don't know if I'd be too very happy with that, knowing that. And I think sometimes we tend to make things harder for ourselves. So we come to this idea that duality by design is not an accident, and in fact is part of the plan. So the duality of humans is a confusing nature of mankind to be twofold, which we know. We talked about this clearly. Robert Louis Stevenson, the author of Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, wrote about this very duality of human nature. It was the idea that every human being has good and evil within them. We're like, duh. This is what Augustine was talking about. There's this duality. There's this fight between light and dark. Is it the duality we see set up in the beginning of creation? Is a duality set up by Christ? It is this duality set up everywhere. We see the suffering on the cross. We see God create a nemesis, which is Satan. So these qualities might seem different from each other, but they work together as part of the whole system. In the first chapter of Genesis, it kind of yields a message. It reveals the design of creation, and in it, the Hebrew root BDL means to split or to separate. This root occurs 5 times the first chapter of the Torah alone. That is the first chapter, not the first book. So 5 times we see this splitting, this separating of one into two. So creation is in fact the splitting off, the making of two out of what was one. Darkness yields to light as the two are separated. Water is separated into upper and lower. In Genesis 2:21, the atom is split. The primal person is split into two, male and female. We see this over and over again. And so the message is very clear that there has to be a relationship. Only a something stands separate from something else, something against which it can be contrasted and compared, something in which it can be in relationship. Can that something really come into existence? In other words, say it this way. Only a something can stand separate from something else. Male stands separate from female, good from evil, black from white, up and down, up from down, war from peace. You get the idea. Something against which it can be contrasted to, something in which it can be in relationship to. Believe it or not, up and down are a relationship of measurement or direction. It's only then that they come into existence. I know up because I know down. I know good because I know bad. I know male because I know female. The psychologist Eric Neumann put it this way. He said, envision a contrasting world, a world in which lightness and darkness divides existence into two hemispheres, pure and impure, good and evil, God and devil. And then imagine that man is assigned his proper task in the context of this. That means we are put in the middle of these dualities, and we then function as we will. Do we succumb or do we overcome? Do we give in to dark or do we do the light? This is our struggle. This is our chance to become better. This is the duality and the design that I see. Suffering for me then becomes only part of the plan. It doesn't become an entity by itself. Suffering is in connection with goodness. And for me, that makes it easier for me to grasp this whole idea. So when I answer those questions. So then we see peace and war, love and hate, up and down, black and white. All these are dualities. Duality even exists in physics and geometry. So therefore, it's pretty obvious duality is part of the design. I don't think anyone would argue with that. Now, a lot of people get nervous and uncomfortable when you mention God and duality in the same sentences. And I'm not saying God, there's a duality in God. I'm simply saying that duality for God is like paint for the artist. It's part of the plan. And I think it's pretty obvious when we go to the scripture, into the text, that we can see that. And then I think when we do that, we can take peace in the fact that there is a plan. It's mentioned multiple times that God has a plan for us. And we do not know this plan because really we couldn't grasp the plan. And it's unconsequential what if we are aware of that or not. And we do know that before the fall of man, there was a fall of angel. And we know that that had to take place because God created a nemesis. And that might make us uncomfortable. We might not like it, but the fact there it is. It's in the Bible and we can hold it to be true. And again, even though we know this hostility between God and Satan, God is in control. Satan does not act on his own. He's not as powerful as God. And that's pointed out over and over again in the scripture. And also, it's abundantly clear that Satan is used by God to accomplish his purpose. And that's what it really comes down to. Well, thank you very much. And I hope I answered some questions. I might have even caused you to have some more questions, which helps me quite a bit. And thank you very much for hearing me ramble on. And I'm curious to hear what you might have to say. So, yes, thank you and have a good evening. Goodbye.